Hello, I'm Hannah, and this is Hannah's Books. Welcome to my very bland current filming situation, which I'll warn you may last for most of the summer. We'll see what I can do, and I'll try to get back to the bookcases again soon. At any rate, I must say I'm glad to be home after a bit more than a week visiting family and a new friend in South Carolina. I traveled south to see my brother and his new wife who live in the area where basically my entire extended family on my mother's side and my father's side have lived for generations. I was down to do some paperwork on my mother's estate and to work on cleaning out her old house if my brother and I had enough time. As it turned out, I was in South Carolina for No King's Day, and I was thrilled to see that Myrtle Beach had two different rallies that day. Each one had a few hundred people. Not a huge number, but certainly more than I expected. I'll show a few pictures, but I will say that they are from local news sources since I didn't have my phone with me at the protests. So many people driving by were honking and cheering and waving flags. We did get a few thumbs down and a few raised middle fingers, but they didn't dampen our mood much. It was lovely to see the energy and unity and joy at these protests. Well, as I said, I got to meet someone I only knew online. In fact, only knew from Booktube. And that's the really lovely Shelley Swearingen. She picked me up at my grandmother's old house where I was staying. She died 30 years ago, but we still call the house Granny's house. So Shelley picked me up, and we went to a great little coffee shop nearby. Chatting with her was so much fun and so easy and relaxed. We talked about books, but also our families and communities, etc. Just wonderful. Shelley told me about a little bookstore she liked near us, full of lots of used volumes. So we drove up what my mother called the main drag in Myrtle Beach, maybe a mile or so north, and I was amazed to see that the bookstore was on the corner of the small neighborhood where my parents and brother and I lived when I was in high school. We took a little detour and drove past my old house. What fun. Then we hit the bookstore, a charming place called the Back Again Bookshop. It has lots of little alcoves stuffed with science fiction and westerns, mysteries, children's books, biography, travel, and even plenty of military history. Gotta have something for the military historians. And of course, plenty of contemporary and classic fiction. Let me show you. I found several books on a bookcase fairly near the checkout desk, older books in general, that really intrigued me. I saw one written by an older historian friend of mine and wondered if there might be similar histories. I tried to look for a few specific titles, but couldn't figure out how the books were organized. Let's see if you are quicker on the draw than I was. It was fun to poke through the fairly central table full of new books by Myrtle Beach authors. And then I looked at the used book section of local books. These were about not just Myrtle Beach, but the whole state, basically. And what should be there but my father's book, published in the early 1980s. It was an academic history, very readable and once quite popular in undergraduate history classes, about the cultures of enslaved people along the South Carolina coast and the language, Gullah, that developed as essentially a creolization of English and the various languages of the particular area of West Africa where most of coastal South Carolina's enslaved people had once lived. Dad had used as one of his important sources the WPA interviews that were done during the Great Depression with former slaves. I'll talk about this in a future video, but this part of the WPA was a government effort to hire writers and other artists at a time when their financial situation was especially dire. Some of the interviewers who were hired wrote down what they heard in standard English. Some wrote in an effort to reproduce dialect without sticking strictly to what was probably the original wording, but instead was more stereotypical. The person who did the interviews my father used was Genevieve Chandler, who took it as her mission not just to preserve the accounts of slavery that former enslaved people could share, but to preserve the language those people were using. For those of you who watch the fabulous channel Too Tight Lautrec, you may have seen Too Tight's fascinating discussion of Julia Peterkin's Pulitzer Prize-winning novel Scarlet Sister Mary, which is about the same area. Although I still haven't read her work, my father wrote an introduction to a reprint of another book of hers, partly because her use of what literary folks would probably call dialect, although both Peterkin and my father saw it as a full language, a full Creole language, with clear and consistent linguistic patterning and rules. I'm telling you all of this because the daughter of the folklorist Genevieve Chandler married the son of the novelist Julia Peterkin, and she wrote a book herself, and that book was on the local used bookshelf right next to my father's book. Dad would have been so happy about that because Genevieve Peterkin was one of the people he loved most in the world. As I was checking out, I mentioned to the woman behind the counter that her local book section included one person who had lived right around the corner. Very local indeed. Well, let me show you what I bought. Just 3 books. One is a little mass market paperback of Anne Morrow Lindbergh's Gift from the Sea. My mother and grandmother loved this book about one woman's creation of her life. I have their old copies, but for just $1, I like the idea of a copy I didn't have to take good care of. Let me read the lovely intro to you. The beach is not the place to work, to read, write, or think. I should have remembered that from other years. Too warm, too damp, too soft for any real mental discipline or sharp flights of spirit. One never learns. Hopefully, one carries down the faded straw bag, lumpy with books, clean paper, long overdue unanswered letters, freshly sharpened pencils, lists, and good intentions. The books remain unread. The pencils break their points, and the pads rest smooth and unblemished as the cloudless sky. No reading, no writing, no thoughts even, at least not at first. At first, the tired body takes over completely, As on shipboard, one descends into a deck chair apathy. One is forced against one's mind, against all tidy resolutions, back into the primeval rhythms of the seashore. Rollers on the beach, wind in the pines, the slow flapping of herons across sand dunes, drawn out the hectic rhythms of city and suburb, timetables and schedules. One falls under their spell, relaxes, stretches out prone. One becomes, in fact, like the element on which one lies, flattened by the sea, bare, open, empty as the beach, erased by today's tides of all yesterday's scribblings. And then, some morning in the second week, the mind wakes, comes to life again. Not in a city sense, no, but beach-wise. It begins to drift, to play, to turn over in gentle, careless rolls like those lazy waves on the beach. One never knows what chance treasures these unconscious rollers may toss up on the smooth white sand of the conscious mind. What perfectly rounded stone, what rare shell from the ocean floor, perhaps a channeled whelk, a moonshell, or even an argonaut. But it must not be sought for, or, heaven forbid, dug for. No, no dredging the sea bottom here. That would defeat one's purpose. The sea does not reward those who are too anxious, too greedy, or too impatient. To dig for treasures shows not only impatience and greed, but lack of faith. Patience, patience, patience is what the sea teaches. Patience and faith. One should lie empty, open, choiceless as a beach, waiting for a gift from the sea. Okay, I also found The Foolish Gentlewoman, a 1948 novel written by Margery Sharp. Sharp wrote several books for adults, some of which have been reissued by the excellently named Furrowed Middlebrow Press. But I know her because of her children's books, including The Rescuers, about two mice who were trying to save a Norwegian poet, a book meant for children, but with lots to recommend it to their parents. I also love its prequel, Miss Bianca, a story about a charming little mouse who gets things done. The Foolish Gentlewoman, I gather, is sort of a cozy version of the turmoil that hit Britain as World War II ended and families tried to rebuild their lives. And the last book I bought was a book I believe Steve Donahue mentioned recently, the 1954 novel, not that there's much to see, by Hamilton Basso called The View from Pompey's Head. I don't know this novel at all, but according to the overview, it talks about a young white New York City lawyer who returns to his small hometown in the coastal South, near where I grew up, to unravel a mystery that has happened in the Manhattan publishing world. This isn't a mystery in the traditional sense at all, more a grappling with race and class prejudices in the first half of the 20th century in the small town South, and the importance of how the cultures and social mores in those places we grow up can shape us long after we leave. Well, that's it for the bookshop purchases. I spent several more days in South Carolina before I flew home. There were some exciting animal encounters, seemingly every day in the local papers. One day, while a group were playing frisbee golf at a local course, a small hammerhead shark fell out of the sky. The next day, a small black bear living in a neighborhood tree had to be deported by the police. Such is the excitement of much of the news away from the tensions of my current hometown of Washington, D.C. And then I flew home to D.C., and perhaps appropriately landed in the midst of a major storm. Although the flight from South Carolina was smooth, descending through the storm in order to land was an adventure. After we landed, I saw that my local friends were texting about all that was happening in our neighborhood, where power was out and 20 trees or so had fallen. Everything was fine at my house, luckily. I live in an old house, one with no air conditioning, which used to be fine in the area where I live. In fact, many politicians' families used to spend their summers here, inside the Beltway, but quite a bit higher and cooler than the swamp that is downtown D.C. And the old houses were built to catch good breezes, with large windows that opened in just the right directions. Those oversized windows make it hard to install AC window units, unfortunately. And climate change has made living without AC more of a challenge. And the fact that all my neighbors have expanded their houses to greater heights means that my house no longer catches much breeze. So when it's really hot, I head to the library for the day, or a museum, or sometimes a cafe, or the movie theater. At some point, I think I'll have to get all the ducts installed for central AC, but I haven't done it yet. And here is the forecast I saw when I headed back to DC. Yikes. That will do it for this video. Thanks everybody for joining me today here on Hannah's Books. See you soon.